While on patrol, the female police officer suddenly found a huge box of money. Just as she was about to ask the man about the money's origin, an SUV unexpectedly sped towards them from a distance. A few large men, without a word, opened fire. The female police officer, frightened, quickly took cover in her car. However, their target didn't seem to be her. In the chaos, the man seized the opportunity to climb into her car, and only then did the female police officer realize that this deadly disaster was, in fact, related to that box of money. What kind of dirty deal was this money hiding? And what earth-shattering secret was the man carrying? The story must rewind to 5 months ago. In the heart of the city at night, a man named Drake stealthily entered a pawn shop. But he wasn't in a hurry to make a deal. Instead, he first looked around the shop before presenting an intricately crafted watch. Seeing this, the owner quickly took it to examine. It turned out to be a fake, completely worthless. Fortunately, the watch hands were still working. As the owner looked up to offer a price, he realized Drake had vanished without a trace. After the gun smoke cleared, more masked robbers rushed into the shop. One flipped over the counter, taking a key from the owner's person, and smoothly opened the iron door leading to the underground club in the basement. Then, 2 of them slid down using ropes, easily shooting an unarmed security guard in the process. Oliver, after landing safely, immediately drew his gun and cautiously moved along the wall. Sure enough, a straggler was hiding there. After quietly dispatching the last security guard, the other robbers had by now reached the bottom floor. They crept through the dark corridors, searching every room, seemingly looking for something extremely important. A man in a suit, looking like a manager, was roughly dragged out by the robbers. He frantically pleaded, saying that everything had been transferred to headquarters the previous afternoon. The robbers didn't need to make such a big scene. But the leader, Drake, didn't believe him at all and directly slapped the man in the suit twice. With the gun pressed against his forehead, the man in the suit finally stopped being defiant. He reluctantly said he had nothing, then pointed towards the changing room at the end of the corridor. When he pulled open one of the lockers, behind it was a hidden secret door. Under the robber's threat, the man in the suit used his fingerprint to open the door. Behind the door was indeed another world, containing millions of US dollars. Seeing the money that hadn't yet been moved, Drake finally smiled in satisfaction. Afterward, the robbers packed all the money into boxes. The man in the suit tried to warn them about the impending disaster, but Drake sent him to heaven with a single bullet. Before leaving, Drake herded all the witnesses into the vault, tossed in a grenade, and swaggered away. Not long after, the robbers drove the money-laden car to the airport, planning to use this money to start a new chapter in their lives. At this moment, the final boss, Rhodes, appeared in the dark corner. Seeing the meticulously planned robbery go so smoothly, Rhodes couldn't help but applaud them. However, the most important thing now was to remain discreet, absolutely not letting anyone discover their whereabouts, and wait a while longer before splitting the money to celebrate. After assigning the next task, Rhodes immediately ordered his subordinates to transfer the money onto a plane and install tracking devices on each safe box. Although the money was transported smoothly, the plane unexpectedly encountered a snowstorm en route. Under such extremely harsh weather conditions, the plane was eventually struck by lightning and burst into intense flames. 5 months later, a hunter named Harlan appeared in the Alaskan wilderness. Harlan walked on the frozen surface of a lake. This man lived by fishing and hunting daily. This time, he came to retrieve his nets. Just as he was squatting before the ice hole to check the net, he suddenly saw something in the distance. Curious, he took his ice pick and approached to see. The result was the discovery that inside the hard ice shell, half of a human hand was trapped. Harlan, seeing this, forcefully struck the ice with his pick. To his surprise, as soon as he made a hole, a frozen corpse emerged from the water. And while he was gasping for breath, still recovering from the shock, he saw a black object nearby. When he pulled it out, he discovered it was an exquisite coated box. He raised his ice pick and forcefully broke the lock. The moment he opened the box, dozens of stacks of money made his eyes blur. This was a fortune that an ordinary person could not earn in a lifetime. Harlan looked deep into the ice lake, even seeing the money-laden plane submerged at the bottom of the lake. In the evening, Harlan took the money back to his cave. He was wrestling with whether to report it to the police or secretly keep it. At this moment, he still didn't know that this box of money would lead to a deadly disaster. Early the next morning, local police officer Ann was driving on her usual patrol. Today was her first day back at work, and she unexpectedly encountered tourists deliberately causing trouble right after leaving home. The other party wanted to drive across the ice, but due to recent warmer weather, the ice thickness was not enough, just 4 feet, and a slight misstep could lead to the car sinking in death. Therefore, and could only remind them that the lake's surface was closed off. However, the other party completely ignored her, and eventually, their wheels got stuck in an ice hole. Encircled the pickup truck once, then opened the trunk and took out a tow rope to hook onto the rear of the car. Just as she was about to drive to pull the pickup out, she saw Harlan approaching with his fishing net and ice pick, and looked at the fishing gear in his hands and immediately judged him to be a poacher. So she called him over, preparing to check his luggage, and as expected, the money in the coated box was discovered. Seeing this, immediately drew her gun as a warning and thoroughly searched him, confirming that Harlan had no dangerous objects on him, and used her radio to report the situation to the police chief. But before she could finish speaking, she heard a piercing engine roar from a distance, only to see a black SUV racing straight towards them, finally stopping steadily in front of the two. The car door opened, and 3 large men stepped out. They were the robbers led by Drake from earlier. They had been tracking the GPS device on the coated box, and after months of searching, they finally found their way here. Drake, without a word, pointed his gun at Anne's head, demanding she hand over their belongings. Afterward, Drake ordered his subordinates to search the truck, finally finding the box in the car door. Drake knew there was more money on the plane, so he began to interrogate Anne about the whereabouts of the remaining money. But Anne had absolutely no idea where this money came from. Drake was furious, about to shoot him. In that critical moment, Harlan rushed out and tackled him. The tourist nearby also drew his gun to help. Drake was unable to dodge in time and was shot in the arm. Taking advantage of this opening, Anne drew her pistol, launched a counterattack against the robbers. Seeing the situation gradually getting out of control, Anne immediately jumped into the police car. But as soon as she hit the gas, she remembered that her car was still connected to the pickup truck stuck in the ice. While the robbers and Anne were in a standoff, Harlan quickly slid behind the pickup truck and unhooked the tow rope. Harlan also seized the opportunity to jump into the back of the police car. Unexpectedly, the female robber Serena suddenly jumped into the back of the car, but Harlan kicked her out of the car. The enormous centrifugal force sent the coated box flying far away. Serena desperately chased after it, wanting to grab it, but in the end, she was a step too slow, only able to watch as the box sank to the bottom of the lake. Just like that, and successfully got Harlan away. However, the tourist was not so lucky. He was shot by the robbers and died on the spot. In the chaos, looking at the scattered stacks of money floating on the lake, the robbers were enraged. Drake didn't stop to examine his wound, immediately ordering his subordinates to drive in pursuit. Just as they were about to set off, they saw that their tires had been shot flat. Helpless, Drake had to contact his accomplice, Oliver, to drive to them for backup nearby, and was still driving frantically to escape. Along the way, she couldn't help but ask Harlan what was going on. He hesitantly explained that yesterday while fishing, he found a box of money, and beneath the box of money was an airplane. He didn't know if there was anything inside the plane, and then immediately reported the situation to the police chief. She asked him to send people to the ice to assist, otherwise, the robbers would come for them again. After the phone call, Anne intended to rest nearby for a bit, but when she looked down, she saw that the police car was out of fuel. There was no other way. The two had to abandon the car and walk, and had lived here for 30 years. She knew that the ice in these temperatures was particularly fragile, and the ice surface underfoot could crack at any moment. For safety, she untied the rope she had used to bind Harlan earlier and took out a seatbelt to tie around both their waists. This way, even if one person fell, the other could promptly pull them up for rescue. But what the two didn't know was that their figures had been clearly seen by the robbers. Drake immediately ordered his subordinates to pursue. At this moment, his accomplice Martin suddenly spoke up, and in Harlan, being locals, were certainly more familiar with the terrain and risks here. If they risked pursuing everyone, they might very well face danger again. However, Drake didn't care. He only wanted to quickly find the remaining money, so he decisively ordered the driver to continue the chase. As a result, just as his subordinate was about to hit the gas, the thin ice couldn't bear the weight, causing the truck's wheels to immediately sink deep into the ice water. Driver Adrian, seeing this, panicked. Looking at the sinking vehicle, he tried to open the car door to escape, but unexpectedly, the door was jammed by the ice. Fortunately, Martin had experience in this field and immediately instructed Adrian to slowly move to the passenger seat, then untied his own belt and threw it into the car. Adrian grabbed the other end of the rope with all his strength, and then the three on the ice began to pull together. Finally, Adrian was pulled back from the brink of death just before the car completely submerged. Just then, Oliver finally arrived in his car. Drake realized that on this fragile ice, Driving a car would be impossible to catch up with Un and Harlan, so he decisively told Oliver to switch to a snowmobile to continue pursuing the two. At this moment, Un and Harlan had approached the lake shore, but the ice here was even thinner than before. They could even hear the sound of cracking ice echoing from below. Not long after, Oliver caught up. Seeing the opponent getting closer and closer, in desperation, the two could only speed up and rush towards the shore frantically. They stepped on the soon-to-break ice floes. Finally, they luckily escaped onto the shore. Fortunately, this place was quite close to Harlan's camp. He immediately rushed in, rummaged through his toolbox, and took out all his hunting bows, arrows, and animal traps. In this situation, they could only rely on these old tricks to set traps to possibly hold off their pursuers, and their figures had already been seen by Oliver from afar. Fortunately, the opponent had gone out without his head, completely failing to realize the two were setting traps. He directly hit the gas, speeding straight towards them. The snowmobile hit the trap. Oliver was flung tens of meters away. He ignored his injuries and immediately crawled towards the gun that had fallen on the ice. Harlan, quick-witted, immediately fired an arrow, accurately hitting Oliver's thigh. The two immediately wrestled on the ice. Violent impacts continuously struck the ice surface. Harlan, being physically weaker, was pinned underneath. He tried to pull the arrow out of Oliver's body and stab him in other places. Taking advantage of the opponent's pain, Harlan tried to get up and run, but just then, the ice suddenly let out a crisp cracking sound. Harlan couldn't dodge in time and finally fell straight into the freezing lake water. What was even more terrifying was that Oliver had no intention of letting him go and continuously shot into the water with his weapon. Harlan, cornered, could only temporarily swim deeper to hide. Once Oliver on the ice lost sight of his target, he would return to the ice hole to wait for an opportunity to act. He didn't know that it had secretly approached from behind, placing a sharp animal trap on his head. The moment the steel teeth clamped shut, Oliver let out a heartbreaking scream, and the white snowy ice surface was immediately stained crimson, and quickly stopped moving due to excessive blood loss. And, seeing this, quickly ran to the ice hole, pulling the trembling Harlan out of the water. The two knew they shouldn't stay here long, so they immediately took their gear and ran deep into the mountains. However, as soon as they left, Drake and his accomplices drove up on snowmobiles. Serena, getting out of the car, immediately saw a fresh crimson blood trail not far away. She frantically ran over to check, discovering that Oliver was dead beyond words. Seeing the body on the ice, Serena immediately collapsed. It turned out that she and Oliver were husband and wife. She never dreamed her husband would die so tragically. Serena wiped the tears from her face, vowing to kill the perpetrator herself, to personally avenge her tragically deceased husband. Afterward, they followed the footprints in the snow, rushing straight into the mountains to continue their pursuit of the two. At this moment, Un and Harlan on the snow were exhausted. Their speed in the forest grew slower and slower, so they were quickly caught by the robbers behind them. Serena, seeing the enemy, immediately opened fire. A hail of bullets whizzed past the two. In this moment of extreme peril, Drake unexpectedly spoke up, stopping her. He clearly knew their purpose here was to retrieve the money. If Harlan died, they might never find the plane, let alone the money in the containers on the plane. Hearing this, Serena could only suppress her anger and cease fire, then continued to pursue with the other accomplices, and quickly realized that the reason their pursuers could track them so accurately was because of the footprints left in the snow. If they continued to run like this, they would eventually be caught. So she immediately led Harlan into a small stream not far away. The two walked in the freezing water for about 10 minutes. After getting out of the water, they used branches to erase all traces behind them as they walked. Sure enough, when Drake and his accomplices arrived at the stream, they lost their target as there were no more clues. Not long after, they reached an open clearing. Martin, as soon as he stepped into this area, felt something was wrong. At this moment, Serena was blinded by hatred. She ignored Martin's warnings, only rushing deeper into the forest. As a result of her carelessness, she fell straight into a hunting pit trap. It turned out that this area was a hunting ground that Harlan frequently visited. The trap had also been set by him beforehand. It was just unexpected that it would eventually be used against a person. Serena cried out in pain. The other robbers, seeing this, had to temporarily stop their pursuit and work together to pull her out of the trap. Afterward, the group found an abandoned wooden cabin deep in the forest, intending to treat Serena's wound there first. Just as Martin and his accomplices were chatting at the door, a car suddenly drove up from a distance. The two looked closely and realized it was none other than the boss, Rhodes, who had arrived. After hearing his subordinates report, Rhodes swore to make the other party pay. But for now, they were on someone else's territory. Without a strategy, it would be akin to self-destruction. Therefore, the next step was to find a way to win with wisdom. However, before that, he had to deal with the traitor in the team. It turned out that from the very beginning of the robbery, his subordinate Pete, along with another accomplice, had secretly taken $100,000. Afterward, that accomplice had blurted out while drunk that it was all Pete's plan. Rhodes, upon learning this, cut out the accomplice's tongue. Pete, seeing this, trembled in fear and knelt, begging the boss for forgiveness. However, how could a person like Rhodes tolerate a traitor in his ranks? He simply drew a sharp dagger and stabbed Pete repeatedly until the opponent completely collapsed and stopped breathing. At the same time, Harlan finally found a hiding place. At this moment, Harlan was severely exhausted. If he didn't find a way to warm up immediately, he might not see the sun tomorrow. Reluctantly, could only take off Harlan's wet clothes and remove her own outer jacket to keep him warm. During their conversation, the two talked about each other's families. It turned out that Harlan wasn't always a solitary person, but after his wife and daughter passed away one after another, his life also fell into darkness, devoid of any passion or hope for life. After resting for a while, the two continued on their way. Along the road, I met a few old friends. After explaining the situation, they agreed to help fight against the robbers. Just like that, their team of 2 increased to 6 people. When passing through an icy area, the elderly leader named Oz told them that underwater, this area used to be a forest, and the air bubbles visible to the naked eye on the ice were all explosive methane gas. Therefore, extreme caution must be exercised when moving. When it was light, everyone arrived at an ice village. This was the village where Oz and the others lived, relatively secluded and difficult to find, and immediately contacted Chief Rowley. Sure enough, not long after, Rowley's police car sped through the snow and was about to step forward to explain the situation, but the chief unexpectedly spoke first. Headquarters wanted to know where that plane was. How did he know there was a plane? The chief realized he had spoken out of turn and pretended to be calm, pulling in aside and saying she had mentioned it on the radio, but was absolutely certain she had never said such a thing. If that was the case, there could only be one truth. The chief had been bribed by Rhodes long ago. Seeing that he could no longer hide it, the chief could only resort to the power of money, saying that after getting the money, he would give in half. Unexpectedly, the other party was completely unmoved and even intended to report him to higher authorities to revoke his authority. The chief angrily cast aside his disguise, drew his gun, and pointed it at and Harlan. Having no other choice, the two had to follow him into the police car. At the same time, Drake and the others were waiting for good news from the chief in town. But they could never have imagined that the chief would be convinced by Harlan's 3 sentences, intending to find the plane himself to monopolize the money. Harlan said that there was a GPS device in his backpack, and by holding it, he could find the plane's location. The chief, upon hearing this, eagerly reached into the backpack, continuously fumbling for the tracking device. Unexpectedly, he touched a trap that Harlan had set. Rhodes, through his binoculars, happened to see this scene and immediately led his subordinates rushing towards the overturned car. At this moment, Harlan crawled out of the car window. They saw the chief lying on the ground, gasping for breath. Harlan tried to run over and restrain him, but the chief unexpectedly regained consciousness, raising his hand and firing a shot at the two. Just as the barrel of his gun was aimed directly at Harlan, a bullet suddenly flew from a distance, accurately piercing the chief's forehead. It turned out that Drake and Serena had arrived in time. They feared that the chief, in his anger, would kill Harlan. In that case, the money would completely vanish into thin air. In other words, only Harlan had exploitable value. So Rhodes immediately gestured to Martin, telling him to deal with him first. But Martin remembered the recent deaths, and ultimately his conscience wouldn't allow it. So he decisively threw the gun to Rhodes and told him to figure it out himself. A person like Rhodes hated betrayal the most, let alone being humiliated in front of so many people. He angrily raised his hand and fired a shot. Martin was shot and fell to the ground. Seeing the boss he had followed for so many years being so ruthless, he suddenly pulled out a lighter and threw it at the opponent's feet. Under this ice, there was a large amount of methane gas, and the flame immediately ignited the gas, burning fiercely. Rhodes stood in the middle, spinning in panic. In the end, he could only watch as Rhodes turned into a man of fire. In the chaos, Harlan pulled in and ran to the shore. But before he could catch his breath, he realized behind him had suddenly disappeared. At this moment, a cry for help echoed from the warehouse. Harlan dragged his tired body and ran in. discovering and was being held at gunpoint by Drake. The opponent's goal was very simple: to force Harlan to lead him to the crashed plane. While the two sides were in a standoff, and suddenly turned and strongly bumped Drake's chest. Taking advantage of this opening, Harlan also rushed forward and wrestled with Drake immediately. As a result, as soon as he made a move, he was knocked to the ground by the opponent. Seeing Drake's ferocity gradually getting out of control, and seized the opportunity to launch a surprise attack from behind. The two then had a chance to escape the warehouse together, but the opponent had no intention of letting them go. Drake quickly grabbed his gun and pursued them, once again pinning Harlan down and wrestling. In a critical situation, and intervened in time, and finally, the two of them working together completely defeated Drake. After recovering his strength, Harlan once again went to the ice lake. He took off his clothes and dived into the water alone, salvaging all the money from the plane onto the shore. But he chose not to monopolize this huge sum of money and handed it all over to him to handle. Ultimately, this money was transferred to the village that had helped them. For Harlan, improving the lives of the villagers was far more meaningful than personal enjoyment. Today's story concludes here. Thank you for watching the film. What do you think of this film? Please comment below.